associate professor in the Department of Geology here at UCT before leaving to co-found Umvoto Africa, an earth sciences consultancy that is very busy right now. He has contributed widely in his research into African plate tectonics, fractured rock hydrogeology, integrated water resource development, geohazard analysis, and the assessment of georisks. I do hope you enjoy his course. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Nuala. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The level of sound, everyone at the back comfortable with? Okay, good, because there's this mic here. You've seen the overall course outline. That was the whole blurb on the web page, and there are 5 lectures, and these are the titles. I'm going to begin in historical ways, so I'll begin with, in a way, pre and early instrumental seismology, because seismology is a young science, around about 1900, and I'll elaborate on that. That's the topic of the first lecture, and in doing that I'll just be introducing some of the basic seismology and what we call seismic tectonics quite gradually. I don't want to get too technical here, and it's largely going to be about the earthquakes and what we know initially from historical records about them. Then I will talk about the new tectonic framework. You will see in my title slide I use a certain diagram, and that diagram is 50 years old. We have had, depending on how you count it, whether in 66, 67 or 68, the foundation of what we now know as plate tectonics, which is a new sort of integrated science of the whole Earth system. And so that's quite important, establishing that new framework and interpreting earthquakes in that context. And then I'll talk more specifically about parts of the East African rift system and the kinds of technologies that we use now to understand that, because we have moved a long way from ordinary seismology with paper tracers and huge, big, unwieldy instruments, and we now use space technology, GPS, and radar satellites to understand earthquake science in a big way. And then I'll talk about induced earthquakes in the 4th lecture, and that's where we begin to come into mining, reservoirs, and fracking as triggers for earthquakes in the continent. And then going on from there, the actual geohazards, natural and not, and the kinds of associated. Because in Africa we have associated with earthquakes the volcanoes in certain parts, a lot of steep topography, in other words major landslides, and then around the coasts, of course, tsunamis. And sometimes inland we have what would be called earthquake flooding. So I'll talk about those in the final lecture. So that's by way of an overview. So that's this historic diagram. It's due to somebody called Jason Morgan, and it's the first outline of what we call or have called the African plate. And you will see the lines drawn on the eastern side of Africa there down the East African Rift Valley. But at that stage there was thought to be just one African plate. So this is the outline of what I'll be dealing with over the next 45, 50 minutes or so. A little bit of basic seismology and, as I said, seismotectonics. And then the big pre-instrumental earthquakes that have affected the African continent, and some of the really big ones. And of course, the first one might be thought to be a European earthquake, but I'll argue that in fact it is essentially an African earthquake as well. So 1900 when I talk about pre-instrumental, I mean before the invention of the seismograph. The seismograph was invented by an Englishman, John Milne, who worked in Japan between 1880 and about the turn of the century. So what comes after 1900 is essentially the invention of the seismograph, their spread globally, and the beginnings of global seismology, or the science of seismology. So there's some big early earthquakes, and those are listed there. And then Africa's most disastrous earthquake, in terms of the historical account at any rate, is earthquake, again, very close to Lisbon, well, on the other side of the bay, as it were, and that's the 1960 Agadir earthquake. So by way of introduction, that's it. So let's get into the main points. And many of you, I suppose, will be familiar with the basic concept of what we these days call plate tectonics. First of all, that the Earth is divided up into these big, we call them rigid plates or blocks, and the boundaries of those plates are of three types. They're the so-called transform or transcurrent, vertical faults where the blocks slide past each other. They are the places where they diverge from each other, the ridges or rifts, or the East African rift system being one. And then there are the places where they converge, like at what we call the subduction zones. That's that over there. The other point that one just has to be aware of is the distinction between the lithosphere, because it's just not the very surface of the Earth that's moving in these rigid blocks. It's the crust plus about 100 kilometers of the underlying mantle. That's the effectively rigid lithosphere, and that's sliding on a plastic asthenosphere. So those are what those bits of jargon mean. And then, of course, the crust is of two types, continental or oceanic. Oceanic crust gets generated, as you can see in the middle diagram, and consumed again very often at continental margins, whereas continental crust hangs around for billions of years sometimes. It's being created in place, new crust is being created, but essentially a lot of it has been around for a long time. So those are the essential concepts. Earthquakes, the relationship of earthquakes is, in this a rather simplified diagram. The bigger earthquakes are mostly associated where ocean crust is subducted, and this is where the giant earthquakes, magnitude 9 or thereabouts, and the great earthquakes, magnitude 8, are mostly clustered. You do get fairly strong earthquakes along mid-ocean ridges, but because that's where new crust is being created, it's thin, it's fairly plastic and soft. You don't get really big earthquakes. Anything above magnitude 6.5 is not found along mid-ocean ridges. And then on the left-hand side of that diagram, you see the black spot in continental crust. Those are so-called intraplate earthquakes. And they occur also in the ocean. You get oceanic intraplate earthquakes away from the plate boundaries. These are comparatively few compared to those along the actual margins. Now, the other thing that you should be aware of, what is an earthquake, what generates the seismic waves, is what we call the elastic rebound mechanism. And this is illustrated in this diagram, which in the context of where this hypothesis or the theory was enunciated, in other words, along the San Andreas Fault. The San Andreas Fault is a near vertical strike-slip fault. San Francisco is moving northwards relative to the American mainland. This guy, Harry Fielding Reid, observed the displacement of roads, fence lines, and orchards by several meters after the 1906 earthquake. And this is the diagram showing the original undisturbed markers across the fault in the middle. The fault, just before it's about to break, with the elastically, it's like rubber, deformed crust on either side of it, and it's friction holding those two blocks together along that fault. So once the frictional strength is exceeded, the elastically deformed crust on either side just then snaps, and depending on the length and the depth over which it snaps, it will generate any size of earthquake. But in the case of something that's hundreds of kilometers long, like the San Andreas, with something of the order of several or up to 10 or more meters of displacement, that is a great earthquake, nearly magnitude 8. So that after the earthquake, the marker line that you see on the second diagram is displaced in that kind of way. We've gone back to the underformed state. And that's the earthquake cycle. That strain then will resume, start building up again, and after some hundreds of years, possibly, that will be repeated. So that's the way we consider these seismic waves to be generated. And there you have the original kind of seismogram. They were rather, or seismograph, sorry. P waves are ordinary sound waves. My voice is sound waves that are being received by you, and sound waves through the solid earth are essentially the P waves. And that's compression and contraction in the direction of wave propagation. There are other waves which involve the shear motion of the crust, and that kind of wave does not go through liquid. There are no S waves coming out of my mouth, only P waves. These days, of course, seismographs don't look like this. Seismographs very often look something like this, because this thing over here contains digital accelerometers inside it. That's why it can measure how many steps you take. And there are some people who are considering using modern cell phones as if they're left on a desk or in some places, they can actually, and then transmit the information, they can be quite effective digital seismographs, seismometers. So these days, you can fit seismometers into beer cans, you can lower them down boreholes, you can do all kinds of things with them, and including put them into cell phones like this. So a lot of cell phone accelerometer technology was invented because of seismology. So, okay, so these days, after 1977, one has what is called the global digital seismographic era, and that's when something called the GDSN, the Global Digital Seismographic Network, was founded, and there's an actual global consortium that manages that. And is largely run out of the United States Geological Survey. And so stations like TUC in Arizona are part of that GDSN, and that Arizona will be recording digitally seismograms like this from, in this case, it's an earthquake in the Lake Tanganyika area. And so what you see are different components. These are generally 3-component. They're recording in a up-down, north-south, and east-west direction. So one single seismometer can tell from what direction an earthquake wave is proceeding. And you then can see the P waves. You can hardly see them on the horizontal components. You can see a slight little bump over there. But these are for quite a big, nearly magnitude 7 earthquake, about 6.8, I think. And the main waves that come through after, this is time in seconds, some 4,000 seconds at TUC, are what we call the surface waves, which are 2 types. The rally wave, which is really like a horizontal snaking type of motion, whereas the love waves are that. The rally waves, the R waves, are like waves on the surface of the ocean. They're kind of rolling kind of motion. So that's the seismograph. This thing over here, the PS interval, is quite important. Well, I'll show you that later on because we're going to be referring to that. So waves, seismographic waves, they are reflected and refracted. So this is an example of, say, P waves from what we call the focus, the big red dot over there. You can see that there's a direct wave in yellow. There's a reflected wave in green. Coming through over here. There are refracted waves which go then into the mantle at different angles. So it's just like light refraction. It works on the same, essentially, optic principles. And then because the mantle has got a higher P wave velocity than the crust, that the mantle waves actually outrace the crustal waves, and you get a refracted head wave, which after a certain distance begins to come back ahead of the main direct arrival. So these are the ways we begin to understand the velocity structure of the crust. And then those very large displacement surface waves are largely generated by reverberations and reflections and guided wave structures in a layered crust. So this is the way surface waves are generated. So that's just by way of background. So size of earthquakes, when we talk about the size of earthquakes, you may have heard the term magnitude. And this is a fairly simple diagram. Essentially, in order to measure an earthquake magnitude, first of all, one needs to know the amplitude of, in this case, in the case of I see this, I'm having battery problems. I don't know if my technology guy is here, but the pointer is not working very well. Maybe I point it out on this, yeah. We need to know the amplitude on the seismogram, and we also need to know that PS interval, because the PS interval is telling you about the distance to the earthquake. And this is a simple graphical type of chart which shows you, in this instance, this is a particular seismogram recorded at 24-second SP interval, that's there on that side, and the maximum amplitude is 23 millimeters for that calibrated seismometer. And then by connecting those two, you determine that is equivalent to a magnitude 5 earthquake. Just notice that this is a logarithmic scale, and also notice, for example, that if we say we're very close to the earthquake epicenter, say about 20, 30 kilometers away, and I mention this for a reason, at about 3 seconds, and it was a magnitude 6 earthquake, you would be, in this case, we are then going to infer the maximum amplitude. You would be up at the 1,000 or 10,000 millimeter thing. For an old seismograph, the thing would have gone off scale. But with digital seismometers, things don't go off that scale that easily. But more than that, in this particular instance, with what we call the Richter or local magnitude, you are measuring the size of the earthquake at a particular wave frequency. In this instance, those they would be S and followed closely by the Love and Rayleigh waves. They would be we're talking about there would be a particular frequency. Their frequency would be around about a few seconds. But these days, with modern seismometers, we record over what is called a broad band, and we record at many frequencies on digital seismometers, so that we can measure the energy carried not only by the short vibrations of a few seconds, but also the long wavelength vibrations which last tens of seconds or sometimes even tens of minutes with very big earthquakes. And that's quite important. Okay, but that's instrumental seismology. What most people don't think of when they think of earthquakes is the intensity of the shaking. And even before instrumental seismology, the idea that earthquakes could be barely felt or strongly felt, and that could be related to their size in some way, and the location could be mapped, is what we mean by intensity. And so there's a whole ordinal scale which goes from Roman numeral 1 to Roman numeral 12, going from just instrumental, barely perceptible, to catastrophic. And this can be obtained, and these days it's also obtained digitally. The USGS, for example, has a Did You Feel It webpage, whereby people can go on, they can log on, and given these categories can respond in very almost near real time as to what they felt and what the actual sensations, what the damage or whatever was actually happening. So that is what we call intensity, and there are scales. In this instance, the Macaulay scale. There's another one called the MKS, but one doesn't need to know the details. The other important thing that one needs to appreciate for this is when now we begin to get into tectonics, because being able to measure in many different seismic frequencies, we now move into the era of this digital seismology, particularly since 1977, whereby with any major earthquake, and sometimes even some quite even moderate ones, we are able to get digital solutions within a few minutes of what we call the focal mechanism. And you will see on these maps these little, we call them beach ball diagrams. In this case, that Tanganyika earthquake that I mentioned, magnitude 6.6. The surface wave magnitude is 6.6. The body wave, what we call the moment magnitude, which is digitally determined at all kinds of stations from different frequencies of waves coming through, that you can compose what we call a moment tensor, and then decompose that into its different parts. You can tell whether compressional waves are arriving or extensional waves, and from that you then can actually determine the stress field that produced that earthquake. This is an earthquake where the rift has been pulling apart. In other words, the traditionally white quadrant of the beach ball is facing upwards, and that little symbol in the middle there is the P. That is the maximum compression axis. It's a vertical compression which is causing the crust to pull apart. And if it was the red parts which were upwards, the P would be horizontal. It's being pushed together. And you will see in these symbols down on the below, if they were strike slip San Andreas type earthquakes, the fault, what we call the nodal plane, would be upwards vertical, and you would have that kind of pattern, the cross pattern on the beach ball. So that's what when you see these maps, that's how to interpret them. The nodal plane, of course, is ambiguous. You don't know which of the nodal planes actually slipped unless you have further information about the earthquake location. So just to come to South Africa, we know, for example, that earthquakes that occur in the southwestern part of the country are dominantly strike-slip earthquakes. In other words, the compression is horizontal, and it's reactivating. The stress regime is such that its strike-slip weaknesses will be reactivated, such as in 1970 and 1969 in the Ceres-Tilbach area. On the other hand, north of a certain line there, which is a kind of stress province boundary, the crustal stresses are such that it's pulling apart. The extensional axis is horizontal and the compressional axis is vertical. So I mention this because this is where we get into what is these days called seismotectonics. So that's the basic seismological background. So we have, over the last year or so, had this map compiled, and I'll see if we can get in a raw copy maybe at tomorrow's lecture, because it will become relevant. And the lead author on this project is my Algerian friend Mustafa Megrahi, who's now based in Strasbourg in France. And he presented the map at the International Geological Congress in late 2016. So we'll be looking at some elements of this map in detail. You can see the earthquakes in the Western Cape area down here. You see the earthquakes and the beach ball diagrams along the East African Rift system. But initially I want to go on and look up at the northern part of Africa, simply because of the historical significance. This, of course, is the area that Mustafa originally comes from, as I say, he's Algerian. But before we go there, I just want to also refer to this. That's one way of representing the seismotectonics of Africa. Here is what we call a global seismic hazard map. The person who compiled this is on the lower left there. That's Domenico Giardini. He's a Swiss seismologist. And you can see here, the reason I showed this is that Africa is comparatively, and by comparatively compared to the Himalayas, the Alpine Himalayan chain and the western side of the Americas and Japan, for example, a continent of relatively low seismic hazard. So we don't have to be that worried about frequent, really big events. These seismic hazard maps are compiled on the basis largely of historical and instrumental data over a particular time range for that which that data exists. And it's not very much, it's barely more than 100 years. And in parts of Africa, big earthquakes occur with a frequency or repeat time which is much larger than 100 years. We just don't have the information in the catalogues going back to tell how big they are. So a lot of these maps, like for Africa here, this is from the same project, represented in terms of peak ground acceleration, and 100 gals on that scale is 0.1 of a G. So these are not very large accelerations, even along the East African rift that the ground is subjected to. And you can see the hazard in the Western Cape compared to other parts of Africa. But I'll come back to that. Given the short timescale over which, from instrumental and historical data, these maps are compiled, are they reliable? And there's an argument coming out that they are not. That in fact maybe the areas in areas away from plate boundaries, what are regarded as higher hazard zones, are actually now the lower hazard zones. So we'll be talking a little bit about that too. Up on the right-hand side, I show the USGS catalogue, and for those of you who want to make a note of it, the USGS, because it runs the global digital operation, reports in near real-time earthquakes 24/7 throughout the year. And that's the reference. It's to their Golden site in Golden near Denver in Colorado. Lynn Sykes was one of the famous seismologists who introduced the whole interpretation of earthquakes, or the plate tectonic interpretation of earthquakes, and he, in about 1997, together with a student, compiled that kind of catalogue of African earthquakes. And again, you can see where earthquakes have occurred, and you will notice again that there's quite a lot in Central and West Africa, which is quite away from plate boundaries. So we know, and this goes back to 1615, the accounts. So we know that the plate boundaries, either along the North African side or along the East African rift system, are where earthquakes occur frequently, but we have enough historical information to know that they occur away from the plate boundaries in reasonably large numbers as well. So let's just go to Lisbon. Now, we think of this as the Lisbon earthquake because that's where it was reported from, essentially. What is maybe not appreciated was that many parts of coastal Morocco were as equally devastated by that event as the southern coast of Portugal and Spain. So in that sense, it was a major, great African earthquake. But I've just shown the broader plate tectonic context here because the relative motion of what we call now the Eurasian plate on the northern side and the African plate on the south is actually very low there. We're talking about 3 millimeters a year. Compared to the motions along the mid-ocean ridges, which go up to 50 or so, even higher, 60 millimeters a year. Those are very tiny motions, which means that big earthquakes repeat very infrequently along that boundary. And that makes Lisbon 1755 quite an interesting thing to look at. And I mentioned some of the others. Again, this is Domenica Giordini's global hazard, or so-called GSHAP map, showing, and there are a couple of things about it. Very often there are places like up near Algiers over here, which are shown to be relatively low seismic hazard, but just south of the 1365 because that's historical. That's in some of the Arab literature, the 1365 earthquake. That was where a 2003 earthquake event occurred right in the green, relatively safe area. So one has to take some of these seismic hazard maps with a pinch of salt sometime. I bet few people are aware that earthquakes have a patron saint, and that's who it is. I don't know how that comes about, but Saint Alexius is the patron saint of earthquakes. And Lisbon earthquake was, of course, a very dramatic event at a particular time in European history where it influenced, one, the church in a big way. It occurred on a holy day, All Souls Day. And obviously people began to question why, and so many people died in church, that why they had been punished by God in that way. And also many of the Enlightenment philosophers, people like Voltaire, Kant, I think Rousseau even wrote extensively about this event. So in terms of its impact on the psychology of people, it was a very important event. And in 2005 was the 250th anniversary of that event. And so it was regarded by the European seismologists as being a rather important thing to work towards. So there were a number of papers published in the years on either side of 2005. And this is one of them. On the right-hand side, actually, is a diagram reproduced in this paper from a 1930s historical study in which the isoseismals were drawn from the historical accounts. And as you can recall, 10 is disastrous and 9 is ruinous. You can infer from the way those isoseismals are patterned that the focus, the bull's eye, has to be offshore somewhere. And so there was a big attempt early in the earliest part of the century to locate the epicenter. What was also reported at the time was that there were damages in places like Meknes and Fez in Morocco. And of course there was lots of tsunami damage along the coast of Morocco. But what came out of the literature was that in fact that was probably a second earthquake, maybe triggered by stress transfer from the Lisbon earthquake, which happened a week or two or more, well, about 18 days, or maybe even more, 4 weeks almost, after the Lisbon earthquake. So we tend to think of what really happened and the destruction in those Moroccan towns as being another big earthquake, also with totally ruinous and disastrous consequences in Morocco at that time. But no doubt these events are linked. Again, just looking at what is going on there, I put this in just to again reinforce the point that one, the motions along what is called the Azores Gloria fault are small circles about what we call the Euler pole. I'll come back to this tomorrow. That's where Eurasia is rotating about that point on the Earth relative to Africa. And so, or in fact, vice versa. So we'll be looking at this. So this is again, and quickly to go through this, the way that what we now call the Nubia plate is moving westwards relative to Eurasia along these strike-slip lineaments. These faults have now been mapped in some detail, and the points to note, the MP and the GB locations are the areas now that are, after these detailed studies, are considered to be the source areas for the Lisbon quake. One of the important things was that it's now considered that both of those faults, on the Marquis de Pombal Bank and the Guadalquivir Bank, had to be activated at the same time. Only there would the isoseismals have been intense enough in places like Lisbon, and only with that large area of source would the tsunamis have crossed the Atlantic Ocean to Jamaica and Hispaniola and parts of the Caribbean. So it generated not only the catastrophic flooding up the Tagus with the nearby tsunami, it was a huge tsunami on the other side of the Atlantic, fairly huge. And so a very big event on that, on these kinds of thrust faults dipping towards each other. And from that, again, this particular study not only modeled the tsunami, it then also modeled the isoseismals, showing, in this instance, the effects on the coasts of Portugal and Spain. What wasn't shown in this was the equally destructive effects on the coast of Morocco. So in that sense, being on the Eurasian-African plate boundary, or just on the Eurasian side of it, it was also an African earthquake. And there are, relating to some of the other earthquakes further south in Morocco, there is the speculation that maybe there's a separate Morocco plate. But that at the moment is still fairly speculative. So coming on to the next major historical thing in the 19th century, there's this map. This is the first global seismological map, compiled by an Englishman, Robin Mallet, who'd studied earthquakes in Italy particularly. There'd been some quite dramatic earthquakes in I think the 1830s through to 1850s in Italy. He had been there, made observations, and then decided to put together a global map of earthquakes. And as you can see, Africa is fairly devoid of earthquakes other than those being marked up in the north there that we've just spoken about. But look down over here in the Cape Town area. And those are obviously Mallet's reporting of the events of 1809 and 1811 in Cape Town. So, and for that he had the records of a certain Mr. W.L. von Buchenroder. So that is what we're going to quickly go on to. But that whole area is still an area which rumbles occasionally. And so this is the context. Largely the fault that is proposed here was the speculation about this fault arose out of Koeberg nuclear power station studies. I was approached by one of the engineering geologists who was a former classmate at UCT, Robin Harris, who came and said he'd discovered the von Buchenroder manuscript and could we work on what this was about. I'd been working on a shear zone with some students on the Witwatersrand coast. And so we put together the idea that this Milnerton fault must exist. We could see the fault and its influence on the rocks, highly sheared rocks at Witwatersrand. And there was some speculation that it went south towards Royals, that's down hidden under the red lettering there, but also offshore to the west of Koeberg. So as a result of that, Koeberg is actually designed against a magnitude 7 earthquake on that structure about 7 kilometers directly off of the power station. Don't know if any of you have ever been underneath Koeberg, but it's got this, what is called an aseismic raft. The ground around will shake, but the nuclear core will remain, and the power station largely will remain stable. So just going back to von Buchenroder and having a look at what he recounts. First of all, he was a naturalist. He just arrived in Cape Town from Indonesia, where he'd experienced earthquakes there, and he was at dinner near the castle when the earthquake occurred. He then went through the town and studiously recording the kinds of damage that he observed, interviewing people, making observations about their experience. And then he visited the actual, what we would call the epicentral area near Milnerton, and made various observations. And that was reported in 1830, obviously some 20 years or more after the event. There was a lot of rumor at the time about Earth had opened, volcanic eruptions, craters formed, lava issued, and he went out and went to actually observe what was on the ground. As he remarks here, it all fell considerably short of what I expected from the wonderful accounts, yet was nevertheless remarkable and interesting. So this is not from Quebec. This is the Darfield earthquake in New Zealand a few years ago. And what it shows is what you see in surface rupture along a strike-slip fault. In this case, it's a left lateral strike-slip fault, it's a right lateral strike-slip fault. Coburg one would have been left lateral. I should have printed this maybe in a mirror image. But what von Buchenroeder reports was pretty much like what you see on the ground there. Up to a mile of fissures. In many places, people were able to push into them rods or switches of up to push the whole length of an iron rod used to fix curtains. Others had been able to do the same with whip handles of even 10 feet in length. So there were surface ruptures there. There were these things they called sand blows, and these were the craters, so-called volcanic craters that were. And again, this is from a New Zealand example. These innumerable holes resembling in shape but nothing else craters in miniature. He goes on to describe these and the way they were lined with clay. And again, this is again from Christchurch in New Zealand. What you see when you have both rupture and these sand fountains and what is called sometimes earthquakes fountains, because in this instance, and I'll just repeat what's highlighted in yellow there. People reported that they saw jets of coloured water start from these holes to be the height of 6 feet. So, and he then goes into why these occurred. So, and his account there is actually a very good account from first principles of why they were there. The other thing he reports, which was very controversial and few people took much notice of this, were earthquake lights. This was a picture taken in Mexico City when the magnitude 7.1 earthquake occurred last year. And you get these luminous, sometimes ball lightning or lightning type effects with very large earthquakes because of frictional electrostatic forces and magnetotelluric currents that then discharge to clouds or to other high points on the ground. And so he went and interviewed some slaves who were near the corner of Lion's Head or near Greenpoint. They stated that they saw something like a wagon illuminated by numerous lights proceed swiftly from the opposite side of Table Bay and then ascend halfway up Lion's Head, and when it burst, when it reached the sea, they then immediately felt the shock. So clearly they were linked, this phenomenon was linked to the earthquake. He also quotes a farmer near Rondebosch. And again, he thought it was a thunder and then saw the so-called meteor and saw it strike the Devil's Hill and then felt the second shock. So here we come into these two shocks, one after the other, with this kind of lightning effect between. And again, earthquake lights these days are known to be associated with magnitude 6 earthquakes and above generally. If we go on a couple of years later, just as it was coincidental that von Buchenroeder was in Cape Town at the time, 2 years later, the naturalist William Birchall happened to be in Cape Town when the biggest aftershock from 1809 occurred. That was on June the 2nd, 1811. And again, I've highlighted the parts of Birchall's account, which he, again, records very faithfully. And the important point over here was 3 or 4 seconds after the initial report, like a cannon going off, the violent explosion, he then felt another report after 3 or 4 seconds, even more violent and sharp. And then immediately after that, there was a strange and unusual motion. In other words, the floor started heaving And there's the dreadful concussion. So von Burchell's account is exactly the kind of account that people have often given who are very close to a large earthquake, where they think there have been two earthquakes, but in fact it is the P concussion coming through, immediately followed within a few seconds by the S wave and the very close-in Love and Raleigh waves immediately behind that. So we can then, from that, the interval, we can begin to calculate distances and play around with possible depths. And so this is what we've done. And combining these things, our conclusion that this is something which we published for disaster management in Cape Town, was that the Jan Bieserskraal area where the most damage had occurred was not where the epicenter was. The epicenter was probably north of Witwatersrand, offshore, south of Melkbos. And that's based on the von Buchenroder account and tying it into the PS interval that's likely and the possible depths, and also the account of the slaves. The slaves would not have seen something in their position arising from the Jan Bieserskraal area. They describe something coming from north and the Saldanha Bay region. And that seems to be the white line on that diagram is the kind of line of sight beyond which to the right they would have had no visibility. So those are the important things. We've gone into looking at this, so synthesizing that information and assuming that it was all coming from the same focal area, we are beginning to get a handle on distance and depth in that area. So we've also actually used that as a scenario earthquake. We did this in 2009 as a part of a study for Western Cape disaster management, because we were hoping to organize a bicentennial event on the occasion of December the 4th, 2009. When I approached, after we delivered the report, I approached the guy in disaster management who'd commissioned it, and he said, "Chris, do you know what's happening on December the 4th, 2009 at the Cape Town International Conference Centre? It's the draw for the 2010 World Cup." There's no way we want this kind of publicity at this time. We'll take a rain check on that, thank you. Yeah. So maybe it's going to be deferred to 2019, December the 4th. Yeah. I'm still pushing them on this one. So, but the person who did this, Max Weiss, who did the study in collaboration with myself and Jacques Puerta, is Swiss seismologist, had a very distinguished career in the United States. And on his retirement, he runs a foundation which does real-time loss simulation, anytime, anywhere in on the planet. And that's why this thing over here is his laptop and communication system, which he virtually has chained to his wrist. Sorry, I've just gone back. Oh, sorry, just want to go back to that. So Max does this professionally as part of a Swiss aid initiative to forecast in advance whether aid teams need to be mobilized within hours of an earthquake. Because in the case of the Pakistan earthquake in 2008, he was predicting within 30 minutes of the event that something like 80,000 people would die. And with rescues like that, you need to mobilize within 72 hours in order to be able and get to people. There's a so-called golden window of 72 hours. And this is the reason he does this, is to inform international earthquake rescue teams that this one you don't need to worry about. This one, guys, get on the plane in the next few hours. And so and he's run a very successful program. We ran this program in a kind of reverse sense, in that we were playing around with a repeat of 1809 in 2006. We had this is a Russian computer program, and that's why you get some strange spellings here. And so this is the damage forecast for 2006 population in Cape Town. It's actually quite a scary thing if it recurred, and our best estimate is this B07 scenario. Magnitude 6.2, 15 kilometer depth in that position off Melkbos, and we're talking about the minimum fatalities of something of the order of 13,000 people. Would be bigger now because our population growth in this area has been such. So we are, that is the scale of event. If it had been deferred to now, or if it had not happened in 1809, but was still waiting to happen. The question is it going to repeat, or can it possibly repeat in this area? We have had small events. This is the 2003 May event. And the Council for Geoscience, because it partly let the local seismographic network decay, their closest station was at Ceres, put the earthquake epicenter somewhere in the Durbanville Hills area. I have a friend this area just south of that, this place over here. This thing is not working very well. That location there, the event was barely felt, but I got phone calls within a few days from the Melkbos-Strand area and the area just north of Melkbos-Strand, reporting cracks in walls, very terrifying experience, and so on. So we are quite certain that the 2003 event did not happen where the Council for Geoscience placed it instrumentally. It happened offshore in the same location as 1809. We are fairly certain about that. And we'll talk about this tomorrow. These are events. Is that place dangerous still? Or possibly has it been de-stressed? So this is one of the big controversial issues in modern seismology. Now, another, again discovered as a result of recent earthquake investigations on behalf of nuclear power stations, is the historical account of 1850 May 21, which is probably the biggest earthquake to have affected Southern Africa ever, probably for thousands of years. And it was previously reported as a rather minor earthquake near Grahamstown. But the only reason that Grahamstown figured conspicuously was because that was where all the newspaper reports were being compiled, where the first reports came in. But in fact, when you look at the extent over which it was felt all the way from some of the more recent historical research. This was work done by an Italian seismologist who specializes in historical investigations. Her name is Paola Albini, and she was in South Africa in 2012. Very diligent at pulling out all the kinds of historical data. And then she went back to some work that was done by Billy de Klerk from the Grahamstown Museum, that, again for late 80s nuclear power investigation. The most intense, greatest intensities were felt at a place called Morley, actually the kraal of Chief Mandela in the Transkei. And you can see again, like the Lisbon isoseismals, they are concentric, and the focus of those concentric circles is somewhere offshore. We think along this, at this area over here, which John Rogers, who's here, and I, together with Zwieb and Abraham, investigated in 1992. We'll come back to that again. So, and this is it, that's Zwieb and Abraham. This is where we think the earthquake occurred, because this is where we actually see the size. These are seismic sections generated by air guns on the ship, but they show quite clearly that there are faults on the seafloor in that area. And so we believe that the other earthquakes that you see listed there, numbers 14, 17, 29, between 1972 and about 2009, like the 2003 event near Millerton, these are these long aftershocks. And those are telling you that this very big earthquake occurred in that region in 1850. That at least is the hypothesis. So those are the really big historical earthquakes. We come on quickly in the next few minutes to the big instrumental events, the early ones. And the biggest earthquake that we've had in this interval since 1900 up to the present day is what is called the Rukwa earthquake. Lake Malawi is down in the south there, Lake Tanganyika, and that little area, the two lakes over there, and this is a very poor, we need a battery, I think, for this. That's Lake Rukwa, and at that time, 1910, there were German mission stations in that area. The damage, those were the houses that were damaged. Fortunately, the key thing about this, and the reason why there was no loss of life, one, there was a foreshock a few days before. There was the main shock, not a few months before, the main shock in December 13th, and then some rather bigger aftershocks in January. The key thing about the December event was that there were minor aftershocks just preceding the main event. Everyone, it was middle of the day, about 1200 hours Greenwich Mean Time, and everyone got out of doors before the main earthquake struck. So nobody was actually inside the damaged houses at the time because they'd all become so alarmed by the foreshocks and probably the memory of the May event. So a very big earthquake. But the other important thing about that earthquake, it was so big that it triggered submarine landslides off northern Mozambique. Those are those numbers, 1 through to 6. And the reason why we know those happened, there were submarine cables over there. And 1, 2, 3, 4 were the sequence in which the submarine cables were broken immediately after that event. So clearly, the continental slope was shaken in such a way that it collapsed, disrupted all of the submarine cables in that area, which were the main ways in which all the kind of communications took place, particularly with marine trade and so on at that time. There are other earthquakes noted, the big fossil fault scarps, and we'll come back to discuss some of those in later lectures. But in relation to these offshore submarine landslides, the other area that we have evidence for big submarine landslides is actually near the possible 1850 epicenter. John Rogers, again, was involved in the coring, getting a 36-meter core with about 500,000 years of record, sedimentary record in the basin. It's hemipelagic ooze, but every now and then a bed of continental shelf sediment comes out 400 kilometers into the deep ocean in that area. So we know that there are big earthquakes that shake and occasionally denude that continental margin as well. So quickly going on, because I'm coming to the end here, the other important events in that region, and we'll talk about this in relation to the extension of the East African Rift System, are these big offshore earthquakes, 1915, 32, which was quite dramatic, felt over a lot of the eastern part of South Africa, even in Johannesburg, as a magnitude 6.5. And some of the others, Swaziland and southern Mozambique in 1940. I'm not going to go into that, and we're coming close to the end here. Sorry, just let me go back to previous slide. This is Africa's, in the last century, and even up to now, Africa's most disastrous earthquake. I forget what proportion of the town 10 to 15,000 fatalities is. It was only a fairly small town, tourist town in Morocco, coastal resort at that time. That's what one of the coastal hotels looked like before the event. That was it afterwards, and it was it wasn't even magnitude 6. The town was so destroyed during that event, it was abandoned after that. That's Agadir. So this is Africa's most disastrous historic earthquake. Before there were seismographs at the time. Again, we don't know too much about this event because global seismology certainly was quite primitive at that time. Again, in the same area, and this is coming back to the north coast of Algeria, I put this up as a final slide, and there's the quote from very eminent seismologist. Earthquakes don't kill people, buildings do. This is a picture taken by a South African engineer who went to Peter Strobos, who went to Boumediès and Algiers shortly after this event to record the kinds of structural damage that occurred. So that's where we're going to leave things now. Tomorrow I'll be starting to talk about the tectonic context of these things and leading into the plate boundary earthquakes, and particularly the newer techniques now that we have for understanding earthquakes that occur on the boundaries but also well away from them. And the other thing that is in my cell phone now is, of course, GPS. And GPS has become a very important seismological tool. In fact, GPSs, modern ones, can be used as seismometers. And are, in fact, pretty much, and I'll be talking about some of that. So we move beyond the ordinary kinds of digital seismology that I've spoken just briefly in passing here, but going on to understand the seismotectonic framework of Africa in terms of being able to locate points basically to millimeter accuracy and to measure rates of motion that are as slow as 1 millimeter a year. And we can do that with modern seismological applications of GPS. Okay. So I was taking time to get used to the operations here and so on. I have run a bit over time, so those of you who have to go, but you're quite welcome to stay on and ask questions if there's anything you need to.